point depth is reading 437. It's kind of showing us.
One of the world's most modern planes lies at the bottom of the sea, with 187 dead passengers and crew inside.
060 true. Yeah, we definitely got lights.
The Boeing 757 left the Dominican Republic in February 1996 with a plane load of German holidaymakers. Minutes later, it plunged into the sea, into shark-infested waters. There were no survivors. The tragedy brings about a remarkable recovery operation. The United States Navy has sent its state-of-the-art machine, Curve, a device that flies underwater, operated by a pilot in a ship above. 7,000 feet down, Curve's antennae pick up the feeble signals of one of the plane's two black boxes. They're coming from an unpromising pile of wreckage on the seabed.
It's like, well...
It's the plane's flight recorder that logs how the pilots have been flying the aircraft. Back in the National Transportation Safety Board laboratories in Washington, this box will tell the whole story of the ill-fated flight. A cockpit instrument had gone wrong. The captain was aware of it, but chose to take off anyway. He and his passengers paid the price. The higher the plane climbed, the faster the faulty instrument told the pilot he was going. He slowed down and down until the plane stalled and fell out of the sky. The wreckage and the bodies still inside will be left here, a lasting monument to a pilot's mistake.
It's like, well...
Tragic plane crash for Britain. After flying 150 million miles, a Viscount, flagship of the British Overseas Airways, crashes into a housing development near the Manchester airport.
40 years ago, most accidents were caused by mechanical failures. Planes are safer now, but human beings cannot be upgraded or redesigned. Pilots are now held largely responsible for 2 out of every 3 accidents. Manufacturers can fix the plane, but how do you fix the pilot?
They have been in service throughout Europe, and Britons devoutly hope it will be the last.
Pilots have long seen themselves as heroic figures. Like ocean sailing, motor racing, or soldiering, flying was the domain of the rugged individual. Once, men fought exhausting battles for control with unwieldy and mechanically unreliable planes, often at the mercy of the weather. A gung-ho personality, coolness in the face of danger were the desired attributes. The right stuff. The modern pilot resembles a bank manager more than Biggles. Sanitized, computerized, new men and women, every one of them. Airlines are doing their best to mold a new improved pilot, to suppress the old macho ways. Among the beliefs that they're trying to get rid of is that it's the pilot's plane, and woe betide any subordinate who dared question that.
Young man, let me tell you something. In the air, I am responsible for this aircraft and the lives of all on board her. And neither you nor anyone else, including the chairman of the corporation, is going to induce me to take her 1 inch off the ground until I'm absolutely satisfied she's in perfect order. Do I make myself clear?
Those lines could have been written for Captain Stanley Key. Key was a decorated wartime pilot, later a training captain. But among younger colleagues, he was seen as brusque, overbearing, a stickler for discipline. Captain Key flew for British European Airways, later to become part of the giant British Airways. In 1972, BEA's younger pilots were fighting for more pay and were prepared to disrupt flights to make their point, a tactic which enraged some senior captains, among them Stanley Key. That afternoon, in the crew restroom, Key had a furious outburst with a junior pilot. A witness described it as the most violent argument I have ever heard. The effects on Key were to be even more dramatic. An hour later, he left to take his flight to Brussels.
He was a very senior pilot, and he was renowned to be a very good operator and a stickler for correct operation. The other two pilots were both quite junior by comparison. In fact, the co-pilot was only 22, very young, very inexperienced, and Key was somewhat suspicious of the abilities of these younger pilots. He was known to be a rather brusque character, and with these very young co-pilots with him, the atmosphere would not have been pleasant at all. That kind of environment is not something that would be accepted in this day and age.
As Trident Papa India took off for Brussels that Sunday afternoon, the atmosphere on the flight deck was poisonous.
VR.
Investigators found graffiti scrawled on the tray table of the junior pilots seated behind Key. Two minutes after takeoff, Captain Key's last flight was over. The Trident fell to earth in a field near the town of Staines. Incredibly, although the field was alongside a crowded main road, the crash at first went almost unnoticed. Local residents were on the scene before police and firemen were even alerted, but there were no survivors. Soon, news of the crash spread on radio and television. Traffic jams built up on the main road as hundreds tried to get a glimpse of the carnage.
Come on, get back! Head goes up, we'll be dead, lover. Come on, move! It was my first major accident that I'd seen, and being what I call a Trident man, it was, and knowing the crews, it was very horrific for me initially, and then it became an interesting job trying to decipher what had happened.
When Ray Davis arrived and began to examine the wreckage, he made a disturbing discovery. There was something very odd about the wings. On jet aircraft, the wings are narrow and swept back so they can fly fast at altitude. But that means that at low speed, such as during takeoffs, they don't generate enough lift. To cope with this, most planes have flaps on the back of their wings that can be extended to give them more lift. The Trident had that little bit extra. Flaps on the front of the wings too, called droops.
A large amount of lift would be generated by the droops, much larger than the flaps, and so the lift producing qualities of the droops were very good. This is shown up in the fact that the aircraft had to be at 3,000 feet and at a speed of 225 knots with a lot of airflow over the wings before the droops could be brought in.
There was no cockpit voice recorder aboard Papa India, but there was a flight data recorder. It confirmed that a terrible mistake had been made.
Okay, V1, rotate.
Okay, the gear up. Okay.
Using information recorded in that black box, two of Captain Key's former colleagues, now senior captains for British Airways, show what happened that afternoon.
Climbing through 300 feet.
They lifted off at about 143 knots and climbed fairly rapidly up into the low cloud base which was covering Heathrow at that time. And they immediately experienced a certain amount of discomfort with the wind and the turbulence. And at 90 seconds, the co-pilot would have cut the power back and raised the flaps.
The heading is turned left towards Epsom.
At about that same time, they would be starting the left turn, which is part of the noise abatement departure. And at some point after that, the droops were raised. And this caused the aircraft to go into an immediate stall. When this droop lever was moved 60 knots too early, there would have been immediately several warnings go off, followed by a stick shaker which warns the pilots by shaking the control column that they were imminently about to stall the aircraft. Immediately afterwards they had a stick push, which is a second level of protection. A ram pushes the control column forward to physically force the aircraft out of the stall position.
Somebody on that flight deck must have then decided that what they were getting was a false stick push situation, because the stick push was actually dumped. There's a lever at the back of the console. That was pulled, and then the nose just came up and it went into the deep stall, because now there was nothing to protect it. And it is very easy to look at the graphs of the flight recorder and say, why didn't they do that, this, why didn't they do that? When it happens in real time, there is, in fact, very little time for anybody to recognize anything in a dynamic situation like that.
There was a whole cacophony of sound and light going on, all at once, totally unexpectedly.
The noise continued throughout, as well as the flashing lights, and the confusion must have been enormous.
How could such an experienced pilot have made such a blunder? Or did he? With no voice recorder, investigators could only speculate. Then, a discovery. The pathologist called in by the Accident Investigation Branch began performing post-mortems.
Looking at the captain's coronary arteries under the microscope revealed that he had severe coronary artery disease. There were clearly some changes which were acute changes in the form of hemorrhage into the wall of the coronary artery. Now that hemorrhage could have occurred a few hours before his death, but it's unlikely to be longer than that. Now we're unable to say whether it killed him or not. It is possible that it did lead to his death or unconsciousness or merely incapacitating chest pain.
Did Key, distracted by pain, bark out a confusing command which, because of his domineering personality, was instantly and fatally obeyed? Did he pull the wrong lever himself, and no one dared query him? Did he die in his seat at the critical moment? Only a cockpit voice recorder could have given the answer.
This was the one thing which was the pity, that this was the accident where we really did need a cockpit voice recorder. The flight data recorder will tell you what happened. The cockpit voice recorder will often tell you why it happened. And in this particular case, we didn't know that, and nobody could prove exactly what happened. With a CVR, we may have had evidence of a medical condition, we may have had an argument, we may have heard a command which had been misinterpreted, but without the CVR, nobody will ever know for certain. With all the flight data recorder evidence we had and the wreckage evidence, nobody will know for certain what happened on that Trident.
Staines was to prove a turning point in British accident investigation. From then on, cockpit voice recorders became mandatory in all British passenger planes. They are now standard equipment on nearly all the world's commercial aircraft. Staines also brought home something else, that a captain's personality could be a matter of life and death. But it took an even bigger disaster to make relationships on the flight deck a matter of vital importance. A badly scratched film records the historic arrival of the first jumbo jet at Heathrow Airport in 1970. It's Pan American Airways Clipper Victor 747. 7 years later, this very plane was to lie in ruins, shattered in the world's worst ever air crash. 583 people died because a pilot was in a hurry to get home. The island of Tenerife in the Canaries. Its beaches are a favorite haunt of sun-starved holidaymakers from all over northern Europe. Way above these beaches, literally up in the clouds, is Tenerife's Los Rodeos Airport. now little used since it became the most notorious airport in the world. 1,000 people lost their lives here in accidents, much of it due to the fact that Los Rodeos is shrouded in clouds on most days. Sunday, March the 27th, 1977 was just such a day. Flying to the Canaries were 2 jumbo jets, Boeing 747s. Both were charter flights, one a Pan American plane full of tourists, the other a Dutch jet belonging to KLM Airlines. One of the many strange things about that day was that neither pilot had set out for Tenerife.
We were starting our descent for the approach and landing at Las Palmas, our original destination. And as we were doing that, we got a call from air traffic control to divert immediately to Tenerife.
A terrorist bomb on the next island had caused this small airport to suddenly become choked with planes. Bob Bragg was the co-pilot on the Pan Am Jumbo. It's the first time he's been back to Los Rodeos since that Sunday in 1977. 20 years later, bits of his plane are still all around.
When we landed here, the entire ramp was completely and totally congested. There were probably 20 to 30 airplanes that had also diverted and were parked here, which necessitated us having to go way down to the end here and park.
By now there are 400 people who've been up all night, half the day before possibly, and they don't quite understand what's going on. And our information was certainly limited at that point. We really didn't know the circumstances or what had actually transpired. The facilities on board, I suppose by now, were a little, well, it was busy, let me put it that way, and everybody was restless.
The Dutch pilot, Captain van Zanten, was getting restless too. His plane had been parked alongside the Pan Am, and the American pilots could hear him constantly on the radio, anxious to be on his way before he ran out of flying hours.
He was very irritated about the situation, as I'm sure all of us were, because most of us had been flying all night long, and we were all anxious to get to our destination. Basically, about that time, he decided to start refueling. Concurrent with that, they opened up the airport at Las Palmas. So the engineer and I got out and walked and measured the wingtip clearance between the KLM 747 and our 747. And we found out that we were about 12 feet short of being able to get around him and taxi out. So we had to wait for the KLM airplane to refuel.
The 2 aircraft had been parked at the wrong end of the runway for takeoff, and with so many planes choking the airport, the only way they could get to the correct end was by taxiing up the runway itself. This simulation recreates the acknowledged facts of the accident. Air traffic control ordered the KLM to go first and wait when it got to the far end. The Pan Am would follow behind, but would turn off the runway about 3/4 of the way along to allow the KLM to take off.
By the time we got the clearance that we were going to leave and take off, people were very happy by then. They were quite elated. These were people who were going to meet a cruise ship in the Canary Islands and cruise around the Mediterranean. And a lot of them were senior citizens that had come from California.
As the Pan Am entered the runway in its turn, clouds began to roll down from the surrounding hills. The American pilots soon found themselves crawling through the dense mist looking for their turnoff. By now the KLM plane had already reached the far end, turned, and was anxious to be on its way.
The tower called us and asked were we off the runway, and I said negative, we're still on the runway, but we will report clear of the runway. We looked up and we saw the KLM airplane's lights, and I immediately saw the lights shaking, and I said, I think he's moving, and then it was very obvious that he was moving. So I started yelling, get off, and the captain turned the airplane, went to full power on the throttles. As we were turning, I looked back out of the right window and couldn't believe it, that he was doing what he was doing. And I'll never forget, I saw the rotating beacon underneath the belly of the airplane. I closed my eyes and ducked. And I didn't even think he'd done us any damage. It was very little noise, very little shaking or anything.
I was just very, very aware of things in slow motion, and everything was flying around, and all of a sudden everything settled, and nothing looked like it had before. I didn't see anything I recognized. There were no people around.
When I looked up, it was obvious that he had done us a lot of damage. The windows were completely gone. I looked back to the right wing was on fire. I looked back to the left, and the entire upper deck lounge was gone. We had 28 people up there, and there was nothing left. It looked like someone had taken a big knife and just sliced the entire top of the airplane off. I could see all the way to the tail of the airplane. So I reached down to try to shut off the engines with the start levers, which controls the fuel to the engines. That didn't do any good. Obviously, all the controls were severed. Then I reached up to get the fire control handles, which is up top, which shuts the engines down. And that's when I discovered that the top of the cockpit was gone. I looked around, there was no side of the cockpit left, so I stood up and elected to jump over the side, which was about 48 feet.
Dorothy Kelly found herself in the cargo hold, but managed to clamber to the top of the blazing plane.
I looked over the side, and it was like looking out of the second floor window from my house with nothing but jagged metal, and my thought was, by now I had lost my shoes. I've survived this, and I'm going to kill myself jumping out of here on all that debris down there.
Dorothy Kelly jumped from the blazing plane, breaking an arm and fracturing her skull. She became the heroine of the crash, rescuing the captain, tending the passengers. People
were lying all over the field, hurt, certainly bloody, very, very badly injured. One thing I remember in particular, there was a man who had his clothes almost completely blown off him. He was just wandering around in a daze, and I remember I kept trying to push him off to the side and get him away, and he would just keep coming right back into all the action. People were just banging in at the windows and shouting. I mean, you could hear shouts, screams from inside. And that was probably my most vivid memory, and what has hurt the most through all those years is remembering all those people and hearing them scream and realizing that they were being burned, and they were not going to get out because there was no way we could get to them.
Tenerife remains the world's worst ever air disaster. 583 people died. Everyone aboard the KLM plane, which was completely burnt out on the runway, all but 77 of the Pan Am passengers. Today, this is all that is left of Pan American Airlines. The company itself crashed in 1992. Paul Royce, one of its senior captains, managed to save the corporate records from a skip. Amongst them were the charred instruments from the Tenerife accident. Royce was one of the official American investigators who arrived in Tenerife next day. As the investigators gathered, their first task was to listen to radio messages between the air traffic control tower and the two planes. Royce heard something that grabbed his attention right away.
There was a point at which you could not tell what the KLM first officer was saying, and we asked that that be played over several times. It was obvious that the man was under stress. His voice changed its timbre. It became tremulous. It was slightly shaky, and his words were blurted out rather than spoken clearly. And that was a benchmark. That caught our attention right away. I believe that the first officer's voice changed because he saw something happening in the cockpit that shouldn't be happening.
But it was the cockpit voice recorders from the two burnt-out planes that were to provide the answer to the mystery. As the KLM plane reached the end of the runway and turned, Captain Van Zanten immediately began to push up the throttles to take off.
First officer said, "No, wait a minute, we don't have our air traffic control clearance." The captain said, "Yes, I know that." He pulled the throttles back. "Now go ahead and call for it."
The controller gave them their air traffic control clearance, which tells them what route they must follow. Then they were supposed to ask for permission for the takeoff itself, but they never got that far.
As the first officer was reading the clearance back to the controllers, the captain again commenced the takeoff. He pushed the throttles up. He said, "We go." The aircraft started to roll. The first officer sensed that this was not right. He knew that they hadn't been cleared for takeoff, and so he blurted out, "And we are taken off, or we are at takeoff." It wasn't even that clear. The words are difficult to comprehend, and the tenor of the voice changes. It's obviously very tense. But he felt that he had done his part in letting people know that they were commencing their takeoff. All this time, the Dutch airplane was accelerating down the runway. The flight engineer in the Dutch cockpit heard the words from the Pan Am airplane saying, "Roger will advise when we're clear," and he questioned the captain and the first officer. He said, "Then is he not clear then?" And the Pan American and both crew members said, yeah, he's clear." At that point, they were just entering the heavy cloud. They saw the Pan Am aircraft desperately trying to get off the runway, but it was not in time. The rest is history.
Yeah, yeah. Computer. Where is that located?
Let's take it. Yeah, let me take a look.
I just want to know where it's located to get a feel. Just to see if it's close.
Under international regulations, the investigation was conducted by the Spanish, but with both the Americans and Dutch allowed to participate.
That's the Selco.
Where is that located?
Selco computer, and I'm trying to think where that is now. That is in that area as well.
Soon there was a split amongst the investigators.
And the fuel flow check.
The Dutch were, in my opinion, searching for something to fasten onto that would divert the blame from their own countrymen. Mainly, I believe they tried to pin the blame on the air traffic controllers. To some extent, they tried to pin the blame on the Pan Am crew.
The stakes were high, not only the reputation of KLM, but of their most famous captain, Jacob van Zanten, the man whose face stared out of the KLM adverts.
Captain Van Zanten was a pilot of great prestige in KLM. He was a top instructor pilot. In fact, he was so well regarded in KLM that it's my understanding when the Dutch officials, or the KLM officials, first heard about this accident, they tried to find Van Zanten to ask him to come down and be part of the investigation team. Unfortunately, of course, he wasn't available.
The Spanish report found that the accident had been caused by the Dutch captain taking off without clearance, a basic error caused by his anxiety to get on his way. But a Dutch board of inquiry absolved Captain Van Zanten of any blame, saying there had been a simple misunderstanding with air traffic control. The pilot thought he had his clearance. Paul Roysch believes that Van Zanten's personality was at the heart of the accident.
He was a difficult man to contradict, especially for a junior pilot such as the first officer on this flight. He did have the courage to stop him once when the captain first started the throttles up, but I don't think he felt he could get away with it again.
Did Tenerife happen because the co-pilot didn't dare contradict his captain, and because the flight engineer didn't dare cut the power during takeoff? Whatever the truth, it had a chastening effect on airlines. Tenerife changed the way that every one of them thought about human error on the flight deck. United, one of the world's biggest airlines. After Tenerife, the buzzwords around here are CLR, or Cockpit Leadership Resource. Every airline now has its own similar program, supplied by academics and costing millions.
And a couple things that kind of facilitate crew effectiveness, and that is communications and decision-making.
They're busy telling pilots how they must relate to each other, and even to the flight attendants, previously regarded as a lower form of human life. the idea was greeted with some skepticism.
And when I went through CLR, I thought it was the biggest bunch of hooey ever to come down the pike. I've since changed my mind on it. But there was one section where the 5 pilots got jumped on the other pilot and made a list of adjectives to describe this particular pilot once it was all over. And I had a list of about 25 adjectives to describe me that my compatriots had given me, and I took it home and showed it to my wife, and she went down the list and she said, "Oh yeah, oh yeah, that's you,
Yeah.
wow."
And you said it is not, right?
And I said it is not.
Yeah, yeah.
And you know, thinking about it, I said, "Well, gee, maybe it is." You know?
Yeah.
There was a lot of resistance. There was a feeling that the few guys that really need it won't get anything out of it. And I think there was, although I mean, I think everybody, after having done it, felt that everybody could get something out of it.
Most I ever heard from a captain was coffee, cream, and sugar, you know, type of thing, and that was your communication in the beginning. Now it's, you know, you get communication of what the flight's going to be like, you know, turbulence, the length of time. If you need any support or need any help, I'm there. To where you now feel like a group instead of the cockpit's here and the flight attendants are back here.
Looking back years ago, I think that door between the cockpit and cabin served more purposes than just to divide those two areas.
Yeah.
I
sort
feel,
of a psychological barrier, perhaps?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I don't feel that anymore.
Okay.
Release your seatbelts and get out! Release your seatbelts and get out!
At the end of class, a mock evacuation after an emergency landing. The pilots witness the flight attendant's job at the sharp end. Training like this is the airline industry's attempt to tackle the problem of human error. But despite the millions being spent on it, no one knows if it saves lives. Meanwhile, pilot error remains the cause of 70% of all airline accidents, and rising. So much so that the aircraft manufacturer's approach is to design the pilot out of the cockpit. This, the first fully automated plane, was flown by a computer.
Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no.
January 1992, a TV reporter in eastern France heard rumors of a plane crash in the mountains nearby. Whilst officials dithered over what to do, the journalist displayed remarkable initiative. He found the plane and the survivors by literally following his own nose.
We saw hundreds of military, gendarmes, firemen waiting, just doing nothing, waiting in the buses, in the cars, in the trucks. And we asked for informations, and nobody was able to tell us anything. There was a smell of fumes, of kerosene fumes. So we decided to go in the forest, just following the smell. And just a few minutes later we heard some voice calling, and we discovered the survivors around a fire. They were badly injured, for some of them, and asking desperately for rescue. It's the main thing I can remember. Every minute somebody was asking for rescues. When are they coming? When are they going to help us?
Ici, il y a des blessés. Vite! On n'en peut plus!
There was a child, a young child, about 10 years. He was in the arms of a man, and it was very emotional to see these people waiting for more than 4 hours, and alone in the forest and in the snow and in the cold, and it was very terrible.
The journalist was exasperated by the failure of the police and troops to arrive some 4 hours after the accident.
I had a phone in my pocket, so the first thing I did arriving there was to call for the fire station and saying, I'm journalist, I'm at the place where the plane crashed and you have to come. The first survivor to be taken away from the site was a little girl of 18 months, and a gendarme took him in his arm and took her to the ambulance. And then, little by little, the survivors being able to walk were evacuated. Then others being injured had to wait for hours. And we know now that at least 2 people died during that time.
The plane they had been on was an A320 Airbus belonging to Air Inter, the French domestic airline. It was on a flight from Lyon to Strasbourg and had ploughed into a mountaintop. The third catastrophe involving the world's most advanced aircraft in less than 4 years. The unveiling of the A320 in 1988. Although in name a European plane, hence the presence of the royal couple, the Airbus is essentially a French creation. It was revolutionary. The A320 was the first civilian fly-by-wire aircraft. Traditionally, a pilot had direct control over his plane by means of cables or hydraulics linked directly to his control column. But in the A320, it was all done electronically. The pilot would feed instructions to a computer, and it would fly the plane. The pilot would simply monitor the computer.
80 knots, thrust.
Electronic displays dominated the new so-called glass cockpit, and the control column was replaced by a side stick, similar to those on a computer game.
V1.
Computers were cheaper. They saved one man in the cockpit and could manage fuel more efficiently. And they were safer. They would review the pilot's actions and refuse what they considered to be dangerous maneuvers.
For the first time in aviation history, pilots had no longer an undisputed and direct access to the flight controls of their aircraft, but were dependent on what the construction engineers programmed into the software of the steering computers. The manufacturer defined what pilot input would be adequate and safe. And this design philosophy was the first step to the elimination of the pilot.
The A320 was cutting-edge technology, now to be seen on all the latest American jets. But it aroused suspicions amongst traditional stick and rudder men. Heino Caesar was Lufthansa's chief safety pilot. He was unimpressed by the computerized controls, especially the so-called side stick.
And the pilot can place his hand on that stick, and he can't feel how the auto-flight system is steering his aircraft. Boeing, much more conventional, pilot-centered, still puts the old-fashioned control column between the pilot's legs, and he doesn't have to look at his artificial horizon, he doesn't have to look at his instruments, he just places the hand on the control column, and he looks outside or talks with the stewardess or talks with somebody else or something like that, and he knows just by placing the hand on the control wheel exactly what his aircraft is doing. Everything. And in these advanced aircraft, you can't feel it anymore. You are restricted to your highly claimed optical channel. You have to pick up everything optical. You can't hear anything, you can't smell anything, you can't feel the thing. You have to look at some instruments.
There followed a series of strange happenings where the computer began to do things that the pilot apparently didn't expect it to do. The first took place at an air show in France with a plane flown by Air France's star A320 pilot. Pilot error, concluded the official report into the accident. The plane was flying too low. The pilot, who survived, unlike 3 of his passengers, claimed that he'd tried to climb, but that the computer had wanted to land, and the computer had won. In 1991, the passengers of this Airbus had a terrifying end to their flight to Moscow. A computer simulation of what happened was made by air crash investigators from the plane's own flight recorder. The German pilot had been told by Moscow Tower to go around, to abort his landing and try again. In such circumstances, the computers are programmed to put the plane into a steep climb. Too steep, thought the pilot, and he tried to push the nose down. The computers pushed it up again, and so on. The result of this civil war in the cockpit was the plane coming almost to a halt in mid-air. Despite going through 4 terrifying stalls like this, the plane eventually landed safely. There were other near-death experiences, such as this one over the skies of Paris in 1994, when a Romanian pilot battled for control of his aircraft. In every case, the plane was not at fault. It behaved exactly as it was meant to. It began to look as if automation had eliminated most traditional pilot errors, only to introduce some new ones. In January 1992, the Air Inter A320 was approaching Strasbourg over the mountains of eastern France.
Flaps vers tout. Flaps sur deux.
This Air Inter A320 captain is recreating the known details of that flight. He demonstrates the small but fatal mistake it's believed was made that night as the plane began its descent. These dials program the computer. This is what should have happened. The pilot enters the angle of descent he wants, 3.3 degrees FPA, flight path angle. But the computer operates in various modes, and this one has been left in the wrong mode, VS, or vertical speed. What is actually done is to tell the computer to descend at 3,300 feet per minute.
Well, it's difficult to pick up that kind of an error from the displays that are available now. There is a label about which mode you're in, but it's hard to see. You're not used to looking at that. Eventually, the mismatch will produce surprising effects in the airplane's behavior. The rate of descent will be higher than you expected. But if you're busy at that time, or if the flight crew is not working together as well, some other factors are happening. You may have a delayed detection of that unexpected aircraft behavior. And these things can happen very fast in an aircraft. 45 seconds may be all the time window that you have to realize that what you expect to be going on is not what's really going on, and the aircraft is being flown into a hazardous situation.
Nierdam, c'est à deux.
Air Inter was the only major airline not to install devices on its Airbuses to warn the pilot that he was too low. It was to prove a fatal decision, later rescinded. The plane was now heading straight for a mountain. "87 people died on the mountain. There were only 8 survivors. Automation had brought a new twist to the problem of pilot error. Pilots were having trouble keeping up with the strong but silent partner in the cockpit.
And they say things like, what's it doing now? What's it going to do next? How in the world did we get into this mode? How do I stop it from doing this? Why won't it do what I want? I know there's a way to get it to do what I want. These are all indications of a breakdown in coordination, in team play between the automation and the flight crew.
It's not a problem that's going to go away.
This flight management system is on all of the modern airplanes. by all of the different manufacturers, whether the MD-11, the Boeing family, 757, 767, or the new 777, the Airbus series. All of these flight management systems impose the same kinds of roles and challenges for the flight crew. Yes, there's detailed differences, but overall the same challenges apply regardless of the specific type of modern aircraft. All of the modern aircraft are vulnerable to this kind of a scenario.
It may be that the pilot's days are numbered. The technology exists to do away with him altogether. Some would argue to do just that. But there is one inescapable fact. When the computer chips are down, pilots believe that only they can get us out of trouble.
Okay, go ahead and recover. And just push the side stick right over there toward the forward corner of the aircraft.
It is absolutely wrong to judge man in the cockpit as the absolute weakest link. He is of absolute flexibility, superseding any computer, and he is the only flexible link in the chain of events. If you are looking at the 14 million departures we are having every year, in hundreds and thousands of cases, the pilots prevented the accident by their action.
And recover. Okay, excellent.
And only in very, very few cases they failed. And this mount up to approximately 15 total losses a year, with an average of 500 deaths. In Germany, we are having 8,000 dead on the streets every year.
Air travel has never been safer. We may come to look back on this as a golden age. The number of people killed in air accidents is about the same now as in 1947, despite a 1,000-fold increase in air traffic. And that's largely thanks to the air crash detectives. But our skies are now getting so crowded that experts fear that in 10 years' time there could be twice as many people dying. Because more flights mean more crashes. More crashes mean more ghastly images on TV news, more upsetting displays of grief. Everyone will feel less safe boarding a plane.
Well, most of us can walk, most of us can drive, and most of us can swim, but most of us can't fly. And I think there's always will be a fascination with flight. And there is just, I think, with the average person, that little sinking feeling in their stomach when they're at 30,000 feet and they're not in control. And so I think there's a fascination there, and there's a strong interest that that this world that we've joined together through aviation, that we can keep it together by having people feel comfortable that they can get on an airplane any place, anytime, and fly safely from point A to point B. And we do an excellent job ensuring that when accidents do happen, we investigate them thoroughly to be sure they don't ever happen again.
There is one final comforting thought, that if you were to board a jet plane at random every single day, then on average, it would be 26,000 years before you were involved in a major crash. And even then, the odds are you'd probably survive it.